In late 1502, off the Malabar Coast of India, the source of Europe's pepper, a Portuguese naval commander named Vasco da Gama ordered his fleet to stop a ship. The ship was called the Miri. It was a large pilgrim vessel sailing from Calicut, carrying people who had performed the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and were on their way home. According to the Portuguese chronicler Gaspar Correia, whose account of these events survives in his Lendas da India, the number aboard exceeded 400. Men, women, children, ordinary people going home. Da Gama had his men board the Miri and strip it of its cargo. The ship carried spices, money, and the possessions of prominent Muslim merchants with connections to the Calicut pepper trade. Then, with the passengers still below decks, Da Gama ordered the hatches locked from the outside. He set the ship on fire. According to the Portuguese chronicles, more than 400 people were aboard. None survived. What nobody watching from those decks, through the smoke and heat, could have fully understood was that this moment had been building for more than a century. The engine behind it was a spice so ordinary that you probably reach for it without thinking. But the story does not start with burning ships. It starts with what that spice cost, and what men decided they were prepared to do to control it. Piper nigrum, black pepper. The dried berry of a climbing vine that had grown along the Malabar coast for thousands of years before a single European tasted it. In the markets of medieval Europe, it sat behind locked counters, weighed in grams, sold at prices that placed it beyond the reach of all but the wealthy. Landlords in England accepted pepper as payment in lieu of coin. The city of Paris levied legal fines in it. When the Visigoth king Alaric besieged Rome in the year 408, among his ransom demands was 3,000 pounds of pepper. The historian Olympiodorus of Thebes recorded that demand and recorded that the Roman Senate paid it. 3,000 pounds of dried berries to save the capital of an empire. The grain you ground this morning carries that history with it. The open jar on the shelf, the cheapness of it, the way it sits uncounted beside the salt. None of that was true in the 12th or 13th century. Pepper's very durability, the fact that it could be grown, dried, carried, and stored for years without spoiling, was the same quality that made the world go to such extraordinary lengths to control it. What began as a crop on a forested hillside above the Arabian Sea would become the thing that set the modern world in motion. But in the villages of the Malabar coast where it grew, it was just a vine. That innocence would not last. What made pepper so expensive in medieval Europe was not scarcity, exactly. The Malabar coast, along the southwestern edge of what is now the state of Kerala in India, produced it in abundance. It had done so for centuries. The vine grew in the wet forest margins. The berries were harvested and dried, and loaded onto boats that moved them north and west, through Gujarat and across the Arabian Sea, through the ports of the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, through Cairo and Alexandria, through Constantinople, and finally into the hands of the European merchants who distributed them north and east across the continent. At every point along that route, a margin was taken. At every port, a toll. At every border crossing, a levy. By the time a sack of pepper that had left the Malabar coast for a handful of coins arrived in a European city, it had passed through perhaps a dozen sets of hands. Frederick Lane, the historian of Venetian commerce, documented this in his landmark work, Venice, a Maritime Republic, published in 1973. Working through the Venetian commercial archives, Lane showed that the price of pepper between its origin in India and its final buyer in Europe could multiply many times over, depending on the route and the decade. Not because the pepper had changed in transit, because the route was controlled. The merchants who sat at the western end of that route were, by the 13th and 14th centuries, largely Venetian. Venice had negotiated exceptional trading terms with the Mamluk sultans of Egypt and built a position of near monopoly on the final leg of the spice trade into Europe. The wealth this generated was extraordinary. The palazzi, the art, the diplomatic reach, the most sophisticated banking system in the world. Medieval world. Much of what made Venice Venice rested in significant part on the price of pepper. By the mid-15th century, the Ottoman Empire, which had expanded to control much of the eastern Mediterranean, had added another layer of restriction and toll over the passage of spices westward. European rulers had understood for generations that whoever could reach the source of pepper directly would upend the trade entirely. What they could not figure out was how to get around the merchants and empires that stood between them and the Malabar coast. This was the problem Portugal had been working on for 60 years. But everyone missed what Portugal was actually building toward. Every ship sent south along the African coast, every cape rounded, every storm survived, was a calculated commercial attack on a system that had made other people wealthy for 200 years. What Prince Henry of Portugal initiated in the 1420s was a deliberate, state-funded commercial strategy. The Portuguese crown sent ships south along the African coast year after year, building a body of navigational knowledge that no European power had possessed before. They developed new ship designs, the caravel among them, light and able to sail closer to the wind than the heavier Mediterranean traders, capable of working along coastlines that larger vessels could not safely approach. They built way stations and provisioning points at intervals down the coast. They kept records. They kept going. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, and proved that the sea route to the Indian Ocean existed. Assembling the resources to complete the voyage to India took another decade. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. In 1497, Vasco da Gama left Lisbon with 4 ships. He was not a diplomat. He was not primarily a merchant. He was a naval commander, appointed by King Manuel I of Portugal, because Manuel understood that if negotiation failed to open the pepper trade, da Gama would not be constrained by negotiation alone. Da Gama reached Calicut in May 1498. The Zamorin, the Hindu ruler of the city, received him. Negotiations began. They did not go well. The gifts da Gama had brought were inadequate by the standards of the Zamorin's court. The Arab merchants who had operated the spice trade in Calicut for generations understood exactly what the Portuguese wanted and worked to prevent it. According to João de Barros in his Décadas da Ásia, the Zamorin was openly skeptical of Portuguese intentions and reluctant to grant trading rights that would undercut the commercial relationships he depended on. Da Gama left Calicut with a small quantity of pepper, a diplomatic letter, and something more important than any cargo: proof that the route worked. The merchants of Venice and the Arab trading networks of the Indian Ocean had, at most, a decade before the entire structure of their trade was dismantled around them. The clock had already started. They could not hear it. Venetian merchants and their agents in Lisbon were writing home about Portugal's progress with increasing alarm through the 1480s and 1490s. Those letters survive in the Venetian commercial archives. The warnings in them were accurate. The response was not adequate. King Manuel I began planning the next expedition immediately. It would be larger, and if negotiation failed again, it would not stop at negotiation. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral sailed for Calicut with 13 ships. He established a trading house and began talks. Then, through a sequence of events whose precise order historians still debate, the situation collapsed into violence. In December 1500, a mob attacked the Portuguese trading house and killed more than 50 men inside. João de Barros recorded the figure in his chronicles. Cabral seized 10 Arab merchant ships in the harbor, executed their crews, and bombarded Calicut for a day before sailing for Portugal. When his report reached King Manuel in Lisbon, the decision was already made. The next expedition to the Malabar coast would not attempt negotiation first. And this is the point where the standard account of the age of exploration changes in ways that schoolroom history almost never manages to say plainly. Vasco da Gama left Lisbon in February 1502 with 20 warships. King Manuel I had given da Gama explicit orders to seize control of the Indian Ocean spice trade by breaking the Arab commercial networks that had maintained it for centuries. He reached the East African coast first. He attacked Arab trading ports. He extracted tribute. He burned those who refused. Then he turned for India. On his way to Calicut in the late months of 1502, da Gama's fleet intercepted the Miri. This was the ship from the opening. This was the locked hatch. According to Gaspar Correia's Lendas da India, the Miri was a civilian pilgrim vessel carrying people who had completed the Hajj and were sailing home to Calicut. Correia gives the number aboard as exceeding 400. Other Portuguese chronicles give different figures, and historians who have examined these accounts note that Correia's specific numbers should be read as estimates rather than exact tallies. The sources agree on this much. The Miri was not a warship. Its passengers were pilgrims returning from Mecca. Among its cargo were goods belonging to prominent Muslim merchants connected to the Calicut trade networks da Gama had been ordered to destroy. Da Gama had his men board the Miri and remove its valuables. When that was done, he ordered the hatches locked from the outside. He set the ship on fire. And somehow, it gets worse. According to Correia, those passengers who broke through the locked hatches and jumped into the sea were driven back from the sides of the Portuguese ships with lances. The fire burned for days. The Portuguese fleet held its position until the ship was gone. Someone in da Gama's fleet wrote it down. The account survived. No record suggests anyone in Lisbon called for a court-martial. The passengers of the Miri had no political role in the pepper trade. They were not soldiers. They were not merchants with competing interests. They were people who had completed a religious obligation and were traveling home on a commercial vessel that happened to carry cargo. What that cargo was and who owned it was enough. Their names do not appear in any Portuguese document from 1502. The goods seized from the ship's hold are recorded in the cargo manifest. The pepper and other valuables are itemized. The names of those who were aboard when the hatches were locked were never written down. We do not know them. That was not an oversight. But the Miri was not an isolated incident. It was one event in a systematic campaign, and the campaign had only begun. Da Gama arrived at Calicut and delivered a message to the Zamorin. Expel all Muslim merchants from your city or face bombardment. Then, to make the message material, he seized a number of small fishing boats in the harbor. According to Gaspar Correia's chronicle, da Gama had the fishermen brought before him, had their hands, ears, and noses cut off, and had the severed parts loaded into a basket with a note for the Zamorin. Other Portuguese chronicles of the period do not contain this specific detail, and historians have noted that Correia's most extreme accounts require careful handling. What is not disputed is that da Gama bombarded Calicut. He did so for an extended period. The Zamorin sent diplomatic responses throughout. Da Gama continued. He returned to Portugal as a hero. He was given the title Count of Vidigueira, lands, and a pension from the crown. The poet Luís de Camões immortalized him in Os Lusíadas, Portugal's national epic, published in 1572. And if the burning of the Miri and the bombardment of Calicut were the only evidence of what the pepper trade had set in motion, it might be possible to read them as the violence of one man in one moment. But then came Albuquerque. Afonso de Albuquerque arrived in the Indian Ocean with a clearer mandate and a more systematic method. He captured Goa in 1510, establishing a permanent Portuguese base on the Indian subcontinent. He captured Malacca in 1511, the great trading port through which the spice trade of Southeast Asia flowed into the Indian Ocean. He attempted to seize Aden, at the mouth of the Red Sea, to block any alternative route for Indian spices to reach Egypt. What Albuquerque built was a monopoly enforced by cannon. The mechanism was called the cartaz, a system of maritime licenses. Every merchant ship wishing to sail in Portuguese-controlled waters, which by 1515 encompassed much of the Indian Ocean, was required to purchase a pass from Portuguese authorities. The pass specified what goods the ship could carry, which ports it could visit, and which routes it could take. A ship found without a cartaz was subject to seizure. Its crew was subject to execution. The historian K.N. Chowdhury documented this system in his 1985 study, Trade and Civilization in the Indian Ocean. He described the cartaz as historically unprecedented. not the control of a specific trade corridor, but the claimed sovereignty over an ocean. The Indian Ocean had been a space of shared commerce for more than 1,000 years before the Portuguese arrived, governed by seasonal winds and mutual agreement among traders from dozens of cultures and faiths. The Cartaz replaced that with a toll enforced at gunpoint. You would think someone in Europe would have said this out loud at the time. Nobody did, not in any terms that entered the official record. The merchants of Calicut and the other Malabar ports did not accept this without a fight. The Zamarin organized counterfleets with support from Egyptian and Gujarati allies. There were naval engagements, raids on Portuguese trading posts, sustained resistance across years. But in 1509, at the Battle of Jiu, the Portuguese fleet decisively defeated the combined Muslim naval force assembled against it. The historian Sanjay Subramaniam, in his 1997 study, The Career and Legend of Vasco da Gama, identifies the Battle of Jiu as the moment at which organized naval resistance to the Estado da India in the western Indian Ocean effectively ended. After that, the pepper moved through Lisbon. If you are finding this history worth your time, subscribe to this channel. There is more of it. By 1510, the volume of spices reaching Venice through the old Levantine routes had fallen sharply enough that the Venetian Senate was commissioning emergency reports on the state of their trade. Frederick Lane, in Venice, a Maritime Republic, traced this contraction through the Venetian commercial archives. The near-total disruption of the pepper trade through Egypt and the Levant within a single generation of da Gama's first voyage. The letters between Venetian merchants and their agents in Alexandria survive and describe in precise commercial terms the collapse of the system on which Venice had depended for 2 centuries. Venice did not fall overnight, but the monopoly that had funded its greatness was broken. The wealth that had built those palazzi was now flowing through Lisbon. The profits from the Estado da India did not simply redirect wealth from one set of merchants to another. They funded something that would outlast the spice trade itself by centuries. The Portuguese crown used the revenues from pepper and other spices to extend its reach along the African coast. The same ships built to find a route to the Malabar coast, the same navigational knowledge, the same Atlantic port infrastructure, were turned to something else. By the 1440s, before da Gama had ever sailed, Portuguese vessels were already bringing enslaved Africans to Lisbon. The routes that the search for pepper opened were the routes through which the Atlantic slave trade would grow into the largest forced migration in human history. These 2 chapters are almost always taught as separate subjects. They were not separate subjects. They were the same ships, the same ports, the same administrative machinery, applied first to one commodity and then to another. The other European powers watched Portugal's pepper profits and drew conclusions. In 1492, Christopher Columbus left Spain looking for a western route to the spice-producing regions of Asia. He believed the world was smaller than it was, and that he could reach the Malabar coast by sailing west. He arrived instead in the Caribbean. He called the people he found Indians because he believed he was near the Indies. He called the capsicum pepper he encountered pepper in his journals because he needed to show his patrons something of commercial value. The historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto, in his 1991 biography of Columbus, documented Columbus's primary commercial objective clearly: access to the spice trade. Discovery, as the later mythology framed it, was not what Columbus was after. He was after pepper. The competition between Spain and Portugal over the spice routes became acute enough that in 1494, the 2 crowns, mediated by Pope Alexander VI, drew a line through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and divided the planet between them. Everything west of the line belonged to Spain. Everything east of it belonged to Portugal. The Treaty of Tordesillas gave 2 small kingdoms on the Atlantic fringe, Europe, a legal claim to the entire world. The people who lived on the lands divided by that line were not consulted. The treaty was not a philosophical document about sovereignty. It was a spice trade dispute that had grown large enough to require a pope. What it created was the framework through which European powers would spend the next 5 centuries claiming, dividing, and extracting from territories they had never seen and peoples they had never met. The age called discovery, from one side of those encounters, had a different name from the other. The Indian Ocean trade world that the Estado da India disrupted had been, as the historian Michael Pearson described it in his 2003 study, The Indian Ocean, one of the most productive and interconnected commercial zones in the pre-modern world. Arab, Indian, Chinese, East African, Persian, and Jewish merchants had traded across it for centuries, governed by seasonal wind patterns, shared commercial convention, and networks of trust built across linguistic and religious lines. The Cartaz did not simply redirect those flows. It dismantled the commercial civilization that had produced the pepper in the first place, and replaced it with a coercive system that required ongoing violence to maintain. What arrived in Europe was pepper. What stayed behind on the Malabar coast was the wreckage of what had been there before. The accounts written from the receiving end of the Portuguese expansion, the chronicles and commercial records from the Malabar coast and the Arab trading world, describe these events in terms that did not make it into the European school curricula that formed around this period. Those accounts have been available to scholars for 5 centuries. One version of this history became the standard version. The other remained specialist reading. There is a logic to what happened that holds from the beginning to the end. Pepper was expensive in medieval Europe because the route was controlled by other people. Europe decided to take the route. Taking the route required ships. Ships required violence to project. The violence required justification. The justifications were trade, and then civilization, and then God. The pepper arrived in Lisbon. The money built more ships. The ships went down the African coast. The routes built for pepper became the conduit for something far worse. In 1502, on a ship called the Miri, passengers returning from Mecca were locked below decks and burned. Their names were not recorded. The weight of the cargo in the hold was recorded. The pepper was accounted for. The Estado da India lasted, in various forms, until 1961, when the Indian military seized Goa and ended 4.5 centuries of Portuguese presence on the subcontinent. What the Estado had set in motion, the habits of commercial extraction backed by force, the legal frameworks through which one group of people could claim the resources and labor of another as property, those had already spread, by 1961, to every inhabited continent on Earth. The peppercorn on your spice shelf did not cause any of this, but the trade network that put it there descends, however distantly, from the system that Albuquerque built and da Gama burned to create. We do not know the names of the people who were on the Miri when da Gama locked the hatches. We do not know what they were carrying back from Mecca, or what they were hoping for when they reached home in Calicut. The records that survive are Portuguese records, and they recorded what the Portuguese cared about. That was never the passengers. If this history matters to you, subscribe to this channel, and leave a question in the comments. What part of this story do you think the standard account leaves out most often? Where pepper led, nutmeg followed, and the Dutch came for it with even less restraint. The nutmeg that wiped out an entire people is on the end screen right now. Tap it and keep watching.